You might have heard this term PMC being used. It stands for Professional Managerial Class. You might like it, you might not like it. You might have heard that it's an insufficiently Marxist definition or usage of class. You may have heard that it's just working class identity politics. You may have heard that whatever. There's all kinds of things that people say. And today, the person who's keeping the concept alive the most publicly is probably Catherine Liu. Okay, but here's the thing. What she wrote in Virtue Hoarders, which is a great book, is a polemic. It's not a theoretical treatise. And so when people reduce the concept to how she uses it in her polemic or how other people have perhaps used it since then, what's being lost on a lot of people is that this is a theoretical concept that has its basis in an actual theoretical treatise. This essay that I read aloud here, this exegetical reading, is the first and most important part of that treatise. So whether you like it, you don't like it, agree with it, disagree with it, whatever, it's good to have a basis in what you're talking about, because most of the people who talk about it don't have that basis. Okay, that goes for just as many leftists as it does post-leftists who use the term. Okay, it's just, I think that that's on you to think for yourself. And so my goal here is not to convince you so much as for you to be convinced that it's at least worth thinking about and it's worth taking Barbara Ehrenreich seriously. This is something that she wrote with her husband at the time. And the two of them, I think, make a good team, or at least in theory, as you'll see here. So here's your theoretical basis in the concept. Enjoy. The Professional-Managerial Class, Barbara and John Ehrenreich. To generations of radicals, the working class has been the bearer of socialism, the agent of both progressive social reform and revolution. But in the United States, in the last 2 decades, the left has been concentrated most heavily among people who feel themselves to be middle class, while the working class has appeared relatively quiescent. This middle class left, unlike its equivalent in early 20th century Europe or in the third world today, is not a minority within a working class or peasant movement. It is, to a very large extent, the left itself. It has its own history of mass struggle, not as an ally or appendage of the industrial working class, but as a mass constituency in and of itself. At the same time, most of the US left continues to believe, correctly we think, that without a mass working class left, only the most marginal of social reforms is possible. None of these historical anomalies about the US left is explained by the theories to which most of the left now adheres. Orthodox Marxism describes capitalist society as being polarized between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. It has nothing to say about a middle class or, of course, about middle class radicalism. Thus, the left today may sense the impasse created by the narrowness of its class composition, but it lacks even the terms with which to describe the situation, much less a strategy for overcoming it. Theoretical confusion about class is endemic among all parts of the left. Some leftists, mainly associated with the new communist movement, describe students, professionals, and other educated workers as petty bourgeois, though more as a put-down than as a defensible analysis. And this is obviously how bourgeois and petty bourgeois became a slur and sort of just like the go-to for dissing someone who seems to have capitalist interests, either central in the way they think or, class analysis is something they remain willfully ignorant of. That person is petty bourgeois, right? It doesn't really mean what it used to. Bourgeois used to just mean productive people, right? For the bourgeois revolutionaries, it was the industrial capitalists and the workers, right? It was the third estate, right? The priest class, the aristocratic class, like these other classes had rights and the power over who gets what privileges in society. And the bourgeoisie were basically like, they had no recognition, they had no rights, they had to fight for that. Marx goes into this in Capital Volume 1. It was a struggle through the parliamentary system in London over the years. And eventually they got the rights to own their property. And so when John Locke, a radical bourgeois thinker, was writing about the right for a person to possess or own the fruit of their labor, this was the beginning of the bourgeois revolution. And obviously, it's something that working class revolutionaries owe a great deal to, right? But of course, the contradiction in the bourgeois revolution was that the workers quickly realized, oh, there is a fundamental difference between us and the owners of these factories. And so that's where the real revolutionary working class movements began. And that's where bourgeois became a slur and didn't and ceased to mean productive people. Okay. But Lukács is a good example, or Sartre is a good example of a thinker who uses bourgeois as just a sort of broad slur. It's just like all the bad things in the world are bourgeois, right? And petty bourgeois became something of a trope for the new left 60s radicals as well. Other contemporary leftists, and the point is so bringing it back to this. So people just call the middle class petty bourgeois. The issue with calling the middle class petty bourgeois is it's not a very defensible class analysis, right? And so a lot of people would probably say, oh, well, it's not really a class. It's kind of a subsection of a class and blah, 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 blah. Okay, well, it's obfuscating and it's more confusing than PMC, that's for sure. But the main thing this article is going to do, if it does anything for anyone who's taking it seriously, is it ought to show how the middle class is not just composed of petty bourgeois people. There's a much more significant presence of the PMC itself. Okay. Other contemporary leftists describe all salary and wage workers who do not own the means of production as working class. The working class, so conceived, is a near universal class, embracing all but the actual capitalists and the classical petty bourgeoisie, as in small tradesmen, independent farmers, etc. But this group, too, finds its definition practically untenable. In practice and conversationally, these leftists use the terms working class and middle class with their colloquial connotations, knowing that the distinction is still somehow a useful one. Yet this distinction cannot be pursued in theory. The prevailing theoretical framework insists that all wage earners are working class and that the notion that some workers are middle class is a capitalist-inspired delusion. And I think it's very common organizing today to find people who will say the words middle class, but then if you were to actually talk about class, they would revert to this position, which is to say, well, there's no such thing as the middle class. There's just people who think themselves as middle class, right? When analysis stops, the problem does not necessarily go away. Rather, it is at that point that the door opens to all kinds of irrational and subjectivist approaches. In the years since the New Left in the US matured from a radical to a socialist outlook, the left has dashed itself repeatedly against the contradictions between its middle-class origins and its working-class allegiance. Some pursue the search for a pure proletarian line to an ever more rarefied sectarianism. Others seem to find comfort in the ambiguities of contemporary class analysis, fearing that any attempt to draw more careful distinctions will leave them in an undesirable category, petty bourgeois, for example. At this point, the very emotion surrounding the subject of class provides a further impediment to analysis. Yet if the left is to grow, it must begin to come to an objective understanding of its own class origins and to comprehend objectively the barriers that have isolated it from the working class. Section 1. Classes in Monopoly Capitalist Society. The classical Marxian analysis of capitalist society centers on two classes and two alone, the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. The other numerically large class of mature capitalist society, the petty bourgeoisie, lies outside of this central polarity and is, in a sense, anachronistic, a class left over from an earlier social order, which undergoes a continual process of proletarianization, as in its members are progressively forced down into the proletariat. Meanwhile, the working class not only expands to embrace the vast majority of the working population, but also becomes more and more homogeneous and unified. That will be one of the crucial things for theorists from Barbara Ehrenreich to Michel Foucault, is to understand why it's not becoming more homogeneous and unified. And theorists of consumerism are really good for this. Baudrillard is one of the best for this. Bourdieu is really good for this. But as we've talked about in this course, the PMC course, as I talked about in my first lecture, the way that public education was set up through this social construction of peer groups that are ranked and ordered on the basis of how one does in sort of arbitrary and largely pointless to our everyday lives tests, not of knowledge per se, but more importantly of obedience. That has a lot to do with the mass proliferation of identitarian difference. Big part of that being the age segregation of an artificial or construction of artificial peer groups. As early as the turn of the century, it was becoming evident that the class structures of the advanced capitalist countries were not evolving along quite so straight a path. The middle classes were simply not withering away. New, educated, and salaried middle-class strata had appeared and were growing rapidly. Most Marxists, however, either ignored the new strata or insisted that they, like the old middle class of independent artisans and entrepreneurs, would become proletarianized. It was left to radical social theorists outside the Marxian mainstream, such as Emil Lederer, and Jacob Marshak in Germany, and C. Wright Mills in the United States, to analyze the new middle classes. In these analyses, the salaried white-collar workers were not seen as a single class, but rather as a disparate group, ranging from clerical workers to engineers and college professors, connected to each other and to the old middle classes by little more than a common desire not to fall into the proletariat. Kind of right there, you see the seed for what later becomes the title of her more popular sort of mainstream book, Fear of Falling. By early in the 60s, the explosive growth and continued social distinctiveness of the stratum of educated wage earners had become impossible for Marxists to ignore. But Marxian theorists were not yet ready to give up the attempt at forcing engineers, teachers, government workers, and accountants into the proletarian mold. Pierre Belleville, André Gorz, and Sergei Mallet were the first Marxists to chronicle and analyze the emergence of what they called, in opposition to Mills and company, the new working class. The new working class, wrote Gorz in 1964, like the old working class, was defined by its antagonistic relation to capital. Technicians, engineers, students, researchers discover that they are wage earners like the others, paid for a piece of work which is good only to the degree it is profitable in the short run. They discover that long-range research, creative work on original problems, and the love of workmanship are incompatible with the criteria of capitalist profitability, end quote. Despite their immediate consciousness as middle class, the growing body of educated workers are, according to this analysis, a stratum of the working class. Nance says, and they use the fear of falling into destitution to keep actual workers in line. Yeah, not only is that used to keep workers in line, but it's also used to tell students they need to try harder, apply themselves to their studies, because if you don't try harder at your schooling, then you're going to be a janitor. You're going to be a dump truck driver. You're going to be whatever the heck is considered to be one of those jobs that nobody who is smart or accomplished is going to hold, right? Because, I mean, in a certain sense, obviously parents everywhere They want their kids to not struggle, right? So teachers are kind of a part of that, trying to keep these kids out of poverty. And they think the best way to keep them out of poverty is success in school. Left unchallenged is the fact that these kinds of jobs, janitor, dump truck driver, factory worker, these things are necessary. They're not just essential workers. These are the most necessary jobs that exist. The most important of all of the jobs. I mean, if we had to choose between doctors and dump truck drivers, it wouldn't be more than a few weeks before people said, all right, I'd rather die from, some easily curable disease than live in a city where there's no trash removal. Okay, maybe I'm going out on a limb here. Maybe not. But point being, it's essential and it's necessary. A decade later, after the rise and decline of a new left based heavily among students and educated workers, it had become apparent that the gulf between the old and new working classes was deeper than the earlier analyses had suggested. Nicholas Poulantzas suggested making a distinction between labor necessary for production of commodities and labor necessary for the reproduction of capitalist social relationships. Thus, according to Poulantzas, workers in the state and other ideological apparatuses, schools, government agencies, welfare agencies, mass media, etc., must be considered as being in a different class from productive workers. In the early 70s, Andre Gors, too, broke with his earlier analysis, arguing that it was not only workers in the ideological apparatuses who served reproductive roles, but also the engineers, scientists, managers, etc., in productive enterprises. The capitalist division of labor has been determined by the need to control the workers and the work process in the context of class antagonism, and not only by technological imperatives. Thus, proposed Gors, even at the point of production, a distinction must be made between productive and reproductive labor. Quote, "We shall not succeed in locating technical and scientific labor within the class structure of advanced capitalist society unless we start by analyzing what functions technical and scientific labor perform in the process of capital accumulation and in the process of reproducing social relations. The question as to whether technicians, engineers, research workers, and the like belong to the middle class or to the working class must be made to depend upon the following questions. 1. A. Is their function required by the process of material production as such, or B, by capital's concern for ruling and controlling the productive process and the work process from above? 2. A. Is their function required by concern for the greatest possible efficiency in production technology? Or B, does the concern for efficient production technology come second only to the concern for social technology, as in for keeping the labor force disciplined, hierarchically regimented, and divided? 3. A. Is the present definition of technical skill and knowledge primarily required by the technical division of labor and thereby based upon scientific and ideological neutral data? Or B. Is the definition of technical skill and knowledge primarily social and ideological as an outgrowth of the social division of labor? Okay, and so you can see in all three of these questions, there is an A and a B. And in the A category, if the answer was yes across all three of these, then this would be quite clearly essential and necessary to production itself, production of profit. Whereas on the other side, it's going to be if a person's answering yes to these to the B categories across all three of these, then they're probably a part of the ideological reproduction of capital, and it's more about the social control of groups, trying to keep people motivated or convinced of the importance of what they're doing, or this is also obviously where media and advertising fit. Both Gors and Poulantzas conclude that there is an unbridgeable objective class distinction, as Gors puts it, between professional, technical, and managerial workers and production workers. The problem, then, is where to place these mental workers in the class structure of capitalist society. But Gors, so far as we know, has not extended his analysis of the class position of technical workers any further. Poulantzas refuses to break with Marx's two-class model, taking refuge in the dogmatic assertion that to, quote, maintain that capitalism itself produces a new class in the course of its development is unthinkable for Marx's theory. He ends by lumping the educated workers along with all other non-productive workers, wage earners, educated or not, in banks, commerce, service industries, government, etc., in a stratum of the petty bourgeoisie, which he calls the new petty bourgeoisie. We will argue that the middle class category of workers, which has concerned Marxist analysis for the last 2 decades, the technical workers, managerial workers, culture producers, etc., must be understood as comprising a distinct class in monopoly capitalist society. The professional-managerial class, PMC, as we will define it, cannot be considered a stratum of a broader class of workers because it exists in an objectively antagonistic relationship to another class of wage earners, whom we shall simply call the working class. Nor can it be considered to be a residual class like the petty bourgeoisie. It is a formation specific to the monopoly stage of capitalism. It is only in the light of this analysis, we believe, that it is possible to understand the role of technical, professional, and managerial workers in advanced capitalist society and in the radical movements. This is the thesis statement paragraph, okay? And it leaves a lot of questions that need to be answered, or begs a lot of questions. And obviously the point of the rest of the essay is to build out this case. All that the Ehrenreichs have been doing up until this point in the essay is establishing that there is a conversation that has been going on. There are people who have been talking about this before they've added their 2 cents and coined this term PMC. And they don't like that these Marxists who have tried to understand this middle class or new petty bourgeoisie or whatever you want to call it, aren't thinking about it in terms of objective antagonistic relations. It seems like a pretty important thing to do if you want to think dialectically. You have to look at the contradictions. And so whether it is a class or whether it is not a class, at the end of the day, that is for you to decide, I guess. You got to think, okay, well, objectively, are there interests that are antagonistic to the working class? Okay, that's going to be the most important question. There are also, for the PMC, antagonistic interests against the capitalists. So the PMC has its own interests that separate it from the interests of capitalists and the rest of the working class and non-proletarianized, lumpen-proletarianized people, right? Let us begin by clarifying what we mean by class. Yes, please do. With E.P. Thompson, we see class as having meaning only as a relationship. The notion, okay, and then this is a quote about class. I'm guessing that this quote comes from the work by E.P. Thompson that is called The Making of the English Working Class, which is a book that I started reading last year, actually. But I'm not going to go down to the footnotes and verify that, but whatever. This is E.P. Thompson is an established Marxist in the field. So that's why she's turning to him for his definition here, because he's very succinct. It goes, the notion of class entails the notion of historical relationship. Like any other relationship, it is a fluency which evades analysis if we attempt to stop it dead at any given moment and anatomize its structure. The finest meshed sociological analysis cannot give us a pure specimen of class any more than it can give us one of deference or love. The relationship must always be embodied in real people and in a real context. Moreover, we cannot have 2 distinct classes, each with an independent being, and then bring them into relationships with each other. We cannot have love without lovers, nor deference without squires and laborers, right? This is dialectical thinking at its best. The point is there is no distinct social entities that are self-standing where you could remove the context, the environment, the history, or the other entities, and then the one under analysis would remain the same. Obviously, if you're looking at the working class and you were to remove all of the other classes, the working class would change in a profound way, right? Who's to say what way? But no matter what, if you kept using the same social or sociological or Marxist categories for analyzing the working class, after all of the other classes had just been removed from the planet and you're using the same categories, it wouldn't work anymore. It wouldn't work anymore. You have to always, instead of getting stuck in the concepts themselves, go back to saying, okay, what did these concepts mean to the people who were using them? What were the people who were using them seeing concretely on the ground and trying to describe by using these concepts? How has the situation on the ground changed? Have these concepts evolved in a way that is based in reality, or has it lost its basis in reality? It's very easy for signifiers to lose their basis in reality because they exist in language, not in physical things around us, right? And it's very easy for us as conceptual creatures who see the world this way, who comprehend everything this way, who never have a clear perception of anything in itself, but always see everything through concepts, to forget the framework that we have, to forget where it came from, and to stop asking the most important critical questions, such as, what were the conditions of possibility for us even being able to use these concepts in the first place? And are they still valid? That's why I consider what they are doing here to be of supreme importance. If we want to understand ideology today, then we have to stop operating with a simplistic framework that was, it wasn't even one that Marx and Engels were strictly dedicated to. Their class analysis was more complicated than the two-class model as well. Most people will admit that. But obviously for polemical, organizational, rhetorical, manifesto style purposes, you're going to focus on the two major players, which is the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, right? Okay. Well, as Catherine Liu says, the PMC has become a major player in the last 100 years. I think she said it went from being 2% of the population during Marx's time to being near 30% in our time. Okay. It follows that any class which is not residual, as in merely leftover from another era, like the European aristocracy in the 19th century, can be properly defined only in the context of 1, the totality of class relationships, and 2, the historical development of these relationships. Thus, if we were going to fully and properly define the professional managerial class, we would not be able to restrict ourselves to a picture of this group as a sociological entity. We would have to deal at all stages with the complementary and mutually interacting developments in the bourgeoisie and the working class. The story of the rise and development of the PMC is simultaneously the story of the rise of the modern bourgeoisie and the modern proletariat as they have taken form in monopoly capitalist society. Here, of course, we can give only a fragment of this story. We will focus on the PMC itself, skimming lightly over the complementary developments in other classes. Okay, point being, obviously, to really understand the PMC, you also have to understand the modern form the bourgeoisie and working class take, right? Because if there's a new class entity, it's going to, because they are relational entities, change the characteristics and mode of the other classes as well. From our point of view, a class, as opposed to a stratum or other social groupings, is defined by 2 major characteristics. 1, at all times in its historical development, a class is characterized by a common relation to the economic foundations of society, the means of production, and the socially organized patterns of distribution and consumption. By a common relation, we do not mean a purely juridical relationship. For example, legal ownership or non-ownership of the means of production. Class is defined by actual relations between groups of people, not formal relationships between people and objects. The former may or may not coincide at any given moment in history with the legal relationships evolved over previous years. The relations which define class arise from the place occupied by groups in the broad social division of labor and from the basic patterns of control over access to the means of production and of appropriation of the social surplus. Okay? And you'll notice here that they are focusing on control over the means of production as opposed to ownership, right? The traditional thing is to say, oh, it's the ones who own the means of production. They're the ones who, like, the entirety of society works to the advantage of the people who own. Yes, but what about the people who control? The people who control have both the workers and the capitalists in a chokehold of sorts. The capitalists are reliant on the people who control the means of production, because if the capitalists are no longer doing it themselves like they were in the time of Henry Ford, right? We have to factor this in. Okay, it's not just ownership of the means of production that defines class relationships. It's also ownership over the means of production. And yeah, I would add, this might be my own addition. I think she might kind of get to this later. The ability to grant privileges, right? The ability to hire and fire, the ability to grant certain human rights or expand rights to certain people. Like this is control over access to the goods that society has to offer. So defining relations on the basis of the division of labor and the basic patterns of control over access to the means of production and the appropriation of the social surplus, that's part one. Part two, however, the relation to the economic foundations of society is not sufficient to specify a class as a real social entity. At any moment in its historical development after its earliest formative period, a class is characterized by a coherent social and cultural existence. Members of a class share a common lifestyle, educational background, kinship networks, consumption patterns, work habits, beliefs. These cultural and social patterns cannot be derived in any simple fashion from the concurrently existing relationships to the means of production of the members of the class. For one thing, culture has a memory. Social patterns formed in earlier periods when a different relation to the means of production or even another mode of production prevailed may long survive their owner's separation from the earlier relationships. For example, the culture of an industrial working class newly recruited from a semi-feudal peasantry is quite different from that of habitually urbanized workers. In addition, the social existence of a group of people is determined not only by its experience at the point of production, but by its experience in private life, mediated especially by kinship relations, which, in turn, are at most only distantly related to evolving relations of production. The relationship between class as abstract economic relationship and class as real social existence has been all but unexplored. For our purposes, we shall have to limit ourselves to insisting that a class has both characteristics. Having stated these two general characteristics, we should strongly emphasize that class is an analytic abstraction, a way of putting some order into an otherwise bewildering array of individual and group characteristics and interrelationships. It describes a phenomenon existing most clearly at the level of society as a whole. When, however, the notion of class is called on to explain or predict infallibly the actions, ideas, and relationships of every individual, it ceases to be very useful. This is actually one of the lines of criticism that Barbara Ehrenreich takes against the sort of pseudo-class analysis done by right-wingers, especially when they are critics of the new liberal class or something along those lines. She is a scathing critic of right-wingers being critical of the PMC because they only see liberals when they think about the PMC. They don't see capitalism. They don't see class as a objective relationship between the other classes, and they don't think about the roles that these classes have in production and social reproduction in the repressive or ideological apparatuses. This is not anything that they think about. They just use like, oh, you're part of the professional managerial class, and then they will define like They will reduce everything, every policy advocated for, or anything that anyone says, if they belong to that class, to their class standing. But yeah, it's not a very good predictor of individuals, right? Class is not. It's for thinking about groups, not individuals. Individuals are, insofar as they are individuals, almost always exceptions in almost every way against whatever the general tendencies in a society are. Everybody has their own idiosyncratic ways of diverging from the main tendencies, stereotypes, and patterns. Okay, so yeah, she's really good for this in Fear of Following. There's a whole chapter where she's going after the right-wingers who try to use this analysis, which is why it's so unfair when people just try to lump her up with them. Okay. Our description of the historical experience of the PMC will be abbreviated and episodic, leaving out many key developments in the history of the class, most importantly, any elaboration on the expansion of the state in the 20th century, and restricting ourselves to the United States. Okay, and that's, leaving out the analysis of the expansion of the state is obviously a little problematic because they're talking about this being a class that emerges with monopoly capitalism. You can't understand monopoly capitalism without thinking about the expansion of the state and how it takes an active role in capitalism. But this essay is already long. They can't do everything in one place. They can't do it all in this essay. We will begin with a schematic definition of the PMC, then describe the emergence of its distinctive class outlook and its consolidation as a class in the early part of the 20th century, and finally return to the situation of the contemporary left. Part 2, a definition. We define the professional-managerial class as consisting of salaried mental workers who do not own the means of production and whose major function in the social division of labor may be described broadly as the reproduction of capitalist culture and capitalist class relations. Their role in the process of reproduction may be more or less explicit, as with workers who are directly concerned with social control or with the production and propagation of ideology. For example, teachers, social workers, psychologists, entertainers, writers of advertising copy and TV scripts. Don't forget, self-help gurus and life coaches and Instagram influencers would all also fit in there. YouTube streamers as well. I mean, all of them. Or it may be hidden within the process of production, as in the case with the middle-level administrators and managers, engineers, and other technical workers whose functions, as Gores, Steve Marglin, Harry Braverman, and others have argued, are essentially determined by the need to preserve capitalist relations of production. Thus, we assert that these occupational groups, cultural workers, managers, engineers, and scientists, etc., share a common function in the broad social division of labor and a common relation to the economic foundations of society. Quick little disclaimer, because people do get very emotional when hearing these kinds of analyses, because obviously, to some degree, it calls into question your own assumptions, your own background knowledge, your own mode of operation in the world today. If you fit into any of those categories, she is not saying that you are bad. She also is in that category. I aim to be in that category. I do not want to spend my life doing nothing but toiling. I want to be able to enrich my mind. I want to be able to think and understand for myself. If you want that, this society tells you, oh, well, then you have to jump through 20 years of educational hoops to be able to eventually get to a tenured position, and then you'll be able to do whatever you want. Okay, that's the problem. A lot of us either cannot get through those hoops or just feel like we would die trying and that it would be pointless and that we would lose our soul in the process. Okay. But the kinds of people who are attracted to this analysis are generally coming from the PMC, and they're generally people who have tried to fit into college, have tried to fit into a career. The people who do really well in the PMC are people who are not super reflective, who are not super critical about the larger contextual things, who are good at adapting to scripts that perform self-awareness about things. And obviously, You could adopt scripts that are performatively self-aware about being PMC as well. That wouldn't change the fundamental nature of the society. So what it says about one at the individual level, that's for you to figure out. What kinds of ways does the dominance of this class that insists on not being self-aware as a class, what are the effects of its dominance on media and organizing today? And how have we internalized various aspects of its assumptions, its mode? That's an essential question if you want to do the Socratic thing of trying to live and examine life. So outside of the question of what to do about it, whether we're going to add value judgments about whether it's good or bad, or how we fit into that overall reproduction of a class society, that's all kind of secondary. I mean, you have to first think about like, okay, but how is this framed how I am in this world? Like, what have I taken for granted? That's step one. Step two is the whole question of, okay, does this change anything in terms of, if does a change in class analysis then result in a different sense of strategic approach to social change? You would think it would, right? The PMC, by our definition, includes people with a wide range of occupations, skills, income levels, power, and prestige. The boundaries separating it from the ruling class above and the working class below are fuzzy. In describing the class standing of people near the divide separating the PMC from other classes, for example, registered nurses, welfare caseworkers, engineers in routine production or inspection jobs at the lower end, middle levels of corporate and state bureaucratic managers at the upper end, we must emphasize two aspects of our definition of class. First, in Paul Sweezy's words, quote, "It would be a mistake to think of a class as perfectly homogeneous internally and sharply marked off from other classes. Actually, there is variety within the classes, and one class sometimes shades off very gradually and almost imperceptibly into another. Second, occupation is not the sole determinant of class, nor even the sole determinant of the relations to the means of production." Okay. I mean, what is all that paragraph saying except that it's complicated? Okay. There's not like sharp, well-defined borders between classes, right? Very wealthy people can live in neighborhoods with people who are on the lower side of the middle class, and they all just see themselves as middle class, right? Consider the case of the registered nurse. She may have been recruited from a working class, PMC or petty bourgeois family. Her education may be 2 years in a working class community college or 4 years in a private upper middle class college. On the job, she may be a worker doing the most menial varieties of bedside nursing, supervising no one, using only a small fraction of the skills and knowledge she learned at school. Or she may be part of management, supervising dozens, even hundreds of other RNs, practical nurses and nurses' aides. Moreover, only 98% of RNs are women. Their class standing is, in significant measure, linked to that of their husband. Some nurses do, in fact, marry doctors. Far more marry lower-level professionals, while many others marry blue-collar and lower-level white-collar workers. So there is simply no way to classify registered nurses as a group. What seems to be a single occupational category is, in fact, socially and functionally heterogeneous. Heterogeneous being the opposite of homogeneous. Homogeneous meaning all the same, heterogeneous meaning fractured, splintered, not the same. Much of the same kind of analysis could be made of most of the other groupings near the boundaries of the PMC. The situation of the groups near the PMC working class border, we should note, is especially likely to be ambiguous. It is here that the process of de-skilling, of rationalizing previously professional tasks into a number of completely routinized functions requiring little training, occurs. Moreover, a disproportionate number of people in these groups are women, for whom purely occupational criteria for class are especially inadequate. Despite the lack of precise delineation of the boundaries of the PMC, by combining occupational data and statistics on property distribution, we can make a very crude estimate of the class composition of U.S. society. By this estimate, about 65 to 70% of the US population is working class. We accept Braverman's conception of the working class: craftsmen, operatives, laborers, sales workers, clerical workers, service workers, non-college educated technical workers. 8 to 10% is in the old middle class: self-employed professionals, small tradespeople, independent farmers, etc., which is obviously what most people would call like the petty bourgeoisie. 20 to 25% is PMC, and 1 to 2% is ruling class. That is, the PMC includes something like 50 million people. The very definition of the PMC, as a class concerned with the reproduction of capitalist culture and class relationships, precludes treating it as a separable sociological entity. It is, in a sense, a derivative class. Its existence presupposes, 1, that the social surplus has developed to a point sufficient to sustain the PMC in addition to the bourgeoisie, for the PMC is essentially non-productive. And 2, that the relationship between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat has developed to the point that a class specializing in the reproduction of capitalist class relationships becomes a necessity to the capitalist class. That is, the maintenance of order can no longer be left to episodic police violence. What she is saying is that a society has to become rich enough, that the ruling class has to become rich enough, that they actually need some level of cohesion and identification from the working class. They have to construct class conciliation. They have to make it so that the workers see themselves in this society, right? That requires a lot of media and propaganda, right? That requires a lot of management. That requires a lot of prefiguring things so as to get to preempt working class organizing. So yeah, the maintenance of order can no longer be left to episodic police violence. And in Fear of Falling, she talks about how the PMC became a more affordable option and a more realistic option than constantly going to groups like the Pinkertons to come and just beat up the workers when they tried to organize. Like direct violence, and this is kind of where Foucault comes in, right? Just coming in and repressing directly radicalizes people to some degree. Obviously, it can crush people's spirits and make them subservient, but that only lasts for so long. The humans, just humans in general, can't put up with that for too long before exploding, right? But if you can find a way to make those little people, the cogs in the machine, see themselves as little capitalists or little PMCs who could potentially eventually become millionaires, billionaires, or there but for some things that occurred, I would have been the manager, I would have been the professional, I would have been, if only for this, if only for that. And so, or if I'd done better in school, right? To individualize the reason for your place, as opposed to thinking about the fact that this place exists and the fact that it's not one fit for a dignified life, right? Nance says, just like Fox News fake populism, PMC does the same thing in a liberal flavor. Yeah. And I think that people who don't like the term, think that it's the usage of the term that creates this difference between groups. It's the usage of the term that creates the difference. It creates this populist resentment, etc. But no, the point is, both for Fox News and for liberal PMCs on MSNBC or on YouTube, the Theorygram, wherever they are, the thing being done is always not just class obfuscation, but the construction of identification with people who are either in the ruling class, or for the PMC, we could call it the controlling class, which is also the class of prestige and academic pedigree and of knowledge workers and of, if you're smart, if you're smart and you're part of us or one of us, then you'll be like this. You'll be like this. You'll be like that. Historically, these conditions were met in the US by the early 20th century. The last half of the 19th century saw one, the development of an enormous social surplus concentrated in monopolistic corporations and individual capitalists, and two, intermittent, violent warfare between the industrial working class and the capitalist class. The possibility of outright insurrection was taken very seriously by both bourgeois and radical observers. At the same time, however, the new concentration and centralization of capital opened up the possibilities of long-term planning, the refinement of management, essentially as a substitute for force, and the capitalist rationalization of both productive and consumptive processes. In the decades immediately following the turn of the century, these possibilities began to be realized. 1. At the point of production, the concentration of capital allowed for the wholesale purchase of science and its transformation into a direct instrument of capital. Science and its practical offshoot, engineering, were set to work producing not only progress in the form of new products, but new productive technologies which undercut the power of skilled labor. This is where Taylorism comes into existence, right? Around 1911, 1911, around then, when Frederick James Taylor's Principles of Scientific Management gets rolled out, right? For more on that, outside of this and in a more approachable way, I think that's less academic and, it's in the lecture form, go to the PMC lectures 1, the first 2 lectures that I gave and that Elton gave. Elton reads a bunch of quotes from the Principles of Scientific Management by Taylor, and it's very eye-opening, and it backs up everything that's being said here. Labor was directly replaced by machines, or else it was scientifically managed in an effort to strip from the workers their knowledge and control of the productive process and reduce their labor as much as possible to mere motion. And I want to stress that, yes, machines can really accelerate the process. Much better to have a backhoe and some gasoline or some diesel or whatever the hell to dig a ditch than a bunch of workers digging the ditch. It's just more efficient. You're not breaking people's bodies. You're instead, utilizing techne to make the process go a lot faster. You're fast forwarding the process in a sense, right? But seen from the perspective of rulers who don't like insurrection, these developments in technology and automation are not only geared towards technical efficiency, right? Technical efficiency is one thing, but social cohesion can be technologically engineered to some degree if you can develop the machines in a way to strip away the skilled labor, because skilled labor requires, time. You can't just replace a skilled laborer with a brand new worker. The skilled laborer knows things that can't be put into a book very well, right? The skilled laborer gets to call the shots to some degree. And if a lot of skilled laborers lock their arms and say, we're not working unless you do X, Y, or Z things for us, right? It's not going to be very efficient in terms of profit. And so technological efficiency is not the only driver of technological development. One could argue that in capitalist society, especially in the wake of the worker antagonism that was being seen at the turn of the century, the main driver of technological development becomes dividing the workers and disempowering them. Okay. As we have argued elsewhere, these developments drastically altered the terms and conditions of class struggle at the workplace, diminishing the workers' collective mastery over the work process and undercutting the collective experience of socialized production. Okay. The next possibility being realized, 2, the huge social surplus concentrated in private foundations and in the public sector began to be a force for regulation and management of civil society. The Rockefeller and Carnegie foundations, each worth tens of millions of dollars, appeared on the scene in the first decade of the 20th century. Local governments increased their revenues and expenditures 5-fold between 1902 and 1922. Public education was vastly expanded. Charity was institutionalized. Public health measures gained sponsorship and the authority of law, etc. These developments were, of course, progressive in both the specific historical as well as the judgmental of the word, but they also represented a politically motivated penetration of working class community life. Schools imparted industrial discipline and American values, American in quotes. Charity agencies and domestic scientists imposed their ideas of right living. Public health officials literally policed immigrant ghettos, etc. 3. Beginning in the 1900s and increasing throughout the 20th century, monopoly capitalism came to depend on the development of a national consumer goods market. Items which had been made in the home or in the neighborhood were replaced by the uniform products of giant corporations. Services which had been an indigenous part of working class culture were edged out by commodities conceived and designed outside of the class. For example, midwifery, which played an important role in the culture of European immigrant groups and rural Black and white Americans, was outlawed and or officially discredited in the early 1900s to be replaced by professionally dominated care. Traditional forms of recreation, from participant sports to social drinking, suffered a similar fate in the face of the new commoditized and privatized forms of entertainment offered by the corporation. For example, records, radio, spectator sports, movies, etc. The penetration of working class life by commodities required and continues to require a massive job of education from schools, advertisers, social workers, domestic scientists, experts in child rearing, etc. The dependence of American capital on the domestic consumer goods market increased. The management of consumption came to be as important as the management of production. To summarize the effects of these developments on working class life, the accumulation and concentration of capital which occurred in the last decades of the 19th century allowed for an extensive reorganization of working class life, both in the community and in the workplace. This reorganization was aimed at both social control and the development of a mass consumer market. The net effect of this drive to reorganize and reshape working class life was the social atomization of the working class, the fragmentation of work and workers in the productive process, a withdrawal of aspirations from the workplace into private goals, the disruption of indigenous networks and support and mutual aid, the destruction of autonomous working class culture and its replacement by mass culture defined by the privatized consumption of commodities, healthcare, recreation, etc. It is simultaneously with these developments in working class life, more precisely in the relation between the working class and the capitalist class, that the professional and managerial workers emerge as a new class in society. The three key developments, this is why she said that this is a derivative class. It's derivative in the sense, and if we want to be clear, like everything's derivative of its historical material situation, right? Because none of these classes are isolatable. None of these exist outside of relationships. But the point is that this is a relation dependent on these three things that come with the turn into the 20th century, okay? The three key developments listed above, the reorganization of productive process, the emergence of class institutions of social control, the commodity penetration of working class life, do not simply develop, they require the effort of more or less conscious agents, okay? Progressives were not, my point, me inserting myself here with exegesis, the point is the progressives who domesticated capital and helped establish monopoly capital were conscious agents. They weren't just like detached, like appendages to machines who were acting out their social roles. No, they had to think and strategize and respond to class war, okay? The development and structuring of public education at the beginning of the 20th century was done consciously as a response to working class antagonism, okay? The expropriation of productive skills requires the intervention of scientific management experts. There must be engineers to inherit the productive lore, managers to supervise the increasingly degraded work process, etc. Similarly, the destruction of autonomous working class culture requires and calls forth the emergence of new culture producers, from physicians to journalists, teachers, admin, and so on. These new operatives, the vanguard of the emerging PMC, are not simply an old intelligentsia expanding to meet the needs of a complex society. Their emergence in force near the turn of the century is parallel and complementary to the transformation of the working class, which marks the emergence of monopoly capital. Thus, the relationship between the PMC and the working class is objectively antagonistic. The functions and interests of the two classes are not merely different, they are mutually contradictory. True, both groups are forced to sell their labor power to the capitalist class. Both are necessary to the productive process under capitalism, and they share an antagonistic relation to the capitalist class. And that's the 3 points, obviously, that people who don't like the term PMC will focus on. Hey, we're all the same, right? We're all forced to sell our labor power to the capitalists. We're not owning anything. Plus, we're all necessary to to turning a profit in this society. And, we all share an antagonistic relationship to the capitalist class. Fair enough. But anybody who says that, who is in the PMC, has to turn and look at their peers and wonder, why is it so hard to radicalize my peers? Why is it so difficult? They don't want to be considered working class unless they're trying to get out of class analysis, and then they just go, "Oh, we're all part of that," right? But if it's not used as we're all workers, then they don't want to think about class. We will return to this point in more detail later. But these commonalities should not just and by the way, they do. If you've ridden along this far thinking, okay, but what's the real objective antagonisms between these classes? They get into a lot more detail with that later. But these commonalities should not distract us from the fact that the professional managerial workers exist as a mass grouping in monopoly capitalist society only by virtue of the expropriation of the skills and culture once indigenous to the working class. Historically, the process of overt and sometimes violent expropriation was concentrated in the early 20th century, with the forced taylorization of major industries, the Americanization drive in the working class communities, etc. The fact that this process does not have to be repeated in every generation, any more than the capitalist class must continually reenact the process of primitive accumulation, the closure of the commons, right, creates the impression that PMC working class relations represent a purely natural division of labor imposed by the social complexity and technological sophistication of modern society, right? It just seems so natural, right? You don't have to remake the PMC in this active, intentional way every generation. The point is that you can be a few generations removed from the making of and see this as totally natural, just part of how society is meritocratic. To the degree that it's meritocratic, I have this profession, and to the degree that you could have been in a higher profession but you didn't, well, that's because things aren't completely fair just yet. But my role is not to go questioned. Yeah, right. The de-skilling of labor is really important here. People talk. There's this debate today around whether we should call low-skilled jobs low skill or not. It's actually a very high skill set to work at McDonald's, not just in terms of what you're making all day, but dealing with people and doing so in an efficient way. It requires a lot of emotional and social effort, right? It's high skill in a sense. And so people want to say, when people say that they're low skill, well, that's not fair. They're actually very high skill. It's okay. No, the de-skilling of labor was not something that was an accident. It was not just, the abstract machinery at work. It was also a direct response to the fact that working people had too much say. Working people had too much power. They had too much sway in everything. So if we piss them off too much, from the managerial standpoint, if we piss them off too much and they stop, they're not easily replaceable. It would require a lot of training to get people back to that point. To make people more replaceable, to atomize people further, requires technological and sociological ways of engineering the de-skilling of labor. These things are not neutral. These things are not accidental. But the objective antagonism persists and represents a contradiction which is continually nourished by the historical alternative of a society in which mental and manual work are reunited to create whole people. It is because of this objective antagonism that we are let to define the professional and managerial workers as a class distinct from the working class. Is it time for a Luddite uprising? Asks Nance, probably ironically, but I can think of at least one person I've had a conversation with in the last 6 months says, you know what, I think that there's something to these Luddites, There's something a little sus about technology, It's a little too easy to think of technology as progressive, What people are getting at when they think about the ways that technology is alienating, the ways that the technological mode inframes everything, reduces everything to the standards of efficiency, maximum output for the minimum input, the ways that it separates people from one another and from their skills, or from a sense of ownership over the process, or from a sense of autonomy in their life world, much less from the knowledge of one's community or of what makes the society function, like alienation. This is obviously something that has a lot to do with technology as we see it, but to see technology outside of capital is the mistake, right? Because as we're showing here, the way that it develops is driven not just by profit, but by a response to class warfare, which is why if you just seize the state and centralize its control under a managerial bureaucratic organ, and if those revolutionaries see this technology as the highest phase of technology, all it needs to be is a little bit more streamlined and a little bit more, better distributed in terms of the social surplus that is produced, better distribute that amongst the workers. Oh, then we're okay. Yeah, but the actual division of labor itself and the technology that's developed around that division of labor is an essential piece of the puzzle. And if you just take it and say, oh yeah, we're just going to make it more efficient, we're just going to make it work for everybody, you're not thinking seriously enough about the way that it works against people, right? The way that it works against basic human needs that go beyond bread, that go beyond shelter, right? Basic human needs like time energy to develop oneself, explore one's talents, find ways of giving back and participating in society at that local level where people, you get to know people, you have something to offer them, they have something to offer you, and it's not something reducible to market exchanges, right? With that stripped away and being fully atomized and replaceable by these, within a market economy where these machines have made us replaceable, no bueno. Nance just wants to ride dolphins and smash machines. Yeah, so I wish that a lot of the energy that goes into the sort of neo-Luddite movement would go towards how do we repurpose, harness, redirect techne, And then a lot of the discussion in philosophy of technology becomes how do we democratize the decisions being made? So suddenly the frame is now democracy, which I guess is okay for appealing to people whose master signifier is democracy, but I don't care how you get there, by hook or by crook, democracy or not. How do we develop automation in a way that brings the social surplus to people at the local level? I'm not saying that everything's done at the local level, but I'm saying how do we make it so at the local level people are empowered, right, to make decisions about how they spend their time and energy? Because without that, there is no freedom, just slavery and domination. Of course, a lot of radicals who take certain PMC assumptions to heart without thinking about it critically would just be like, yeah, damn right. Workers going to work in any society. At least they get healthcare in the society we're fighting for. At least they get, shelter at an affordable cost. But of course they belong there in the division of labor because we got to have somebody do that stuff, right? Well, not always. A lot of shitty jobs, like just outright shitty, demeaning, objectively bad for your health kinds of jobs could be automated out of existence. And a lot of bullshit jobs in the PMC could be abolished as well, right? We could redistribute the necessary labor that can't be automated and everything else gets automated, right? That would be the sensible thing, I suppose. But I digress. We should add at this point that the antagonism between the PMC and the working class does not exist only in the abstract realm of objective relations, of course. Real-life contacts between the two classes express directly, if sometimes benignly, the relation of control which is at the heart of the PMC working class relation. Teacher and student, or parent, manager and worker, social worker and client, etc. The subjective dimension of these contacts is a complex mixture of hostility and deference on the part of the working class. The subjective dimension of these contacts is a complex mixture of hostility and deference on the part of working class people, contempt and paternalism on the part of the PMC. The indeterminate yet antagonistic relationship between the working class and the PMC also leads us to insist that the PMC is a class totally distinct from the petty bourgeoisie, the old middle class of artisans, shopkeepers, self-employed professionals, and independent farmers. The classical petty bourgeoisie lies outside the polarity of labor and capital. It is made up of people who are neither employed by capital nor themselves employers of labor to any significant extent. Obviously, a person could say, well, mom, pop, or the local farmers, they hire some employees, or they have to take out loans, or they find some investors. And so in a sense, they're still subservient to capital. If they're not turning a profit, they go out of business. But the term, the qualification here, significant extent, obviously matters. The classical petty bourgeoisie lies outside the polarity of labor and capital. It is made up of people who are neither employed by capital nor themselves employers of labor to any significant extent. The PMC, by contrast, is employed by capital and it manages, controls, has authority over labor, though it does not directly employ it. The classical petty bourgeoisie is irrelevant to the process of capital accumulation and to the process of reproducing capitalist social relation. The PMC, by contrast, is essential to both. And I would just stress right here, it says the PMC, by contrast, is employed by capital and it manages, controls, has authority over labor, in parentheses, though it does not directly employ it. It does employ it in the sense of hiring and firing, of consolidating, of re-rationalizing the workplace, of undermining organizing at the level of unions. PMC within the unions can also do a lot to undermine organizing within the union, okay? But when she says does not directly employ it, the point is like, yeah, the capital is still coming from investor, right? The PMC, insofar as it's managing an operation, has to make decisions that are going to serve the investors, right? So, but it is the capital in this situation provided by capitalists that actually employs the workers. But the hiring and firing, though, that's the part that is obviously in the hands of the PMC. Okay. Part 3, the rise of the PMC. In order to define more sharply the relation between the PMC and other classes, we turn now to a closer examination of the initial emergence of the PMC, its ideology, and its institutions. The PMC emerged with dramatic suddenness in the years between 1890 and 1920, a period roughly overlapping what historians call the Progressive Era. Table 1 summarizes the expansion of selected professional and managerial occupations at this time. If you're listening to this by podcast, you're not going to be able to see this. If you have YouTube and are listening to this on YouTube, you can turn your eyes to the screen and see it. I will do my best to narrate what's going on table 1, though, so that you don't have to, because you might be driving, you might be playing video games, washing dishes, whatever, changing baby diapers. Okay, so whatever you're doing, let me break it down for you. The table shows a bunch of different occupations: engineers, managers, manufacturing. So managers in manufacturing, social, recreation, and religious workers other than clergy, college faculty, accountants and auditors, government officials, administrators, inspectors, editors, and reporters. Okay. And what it shows is how these professions become larger over time, starting in 1870, and then it just shows you decade by decade. So 1870, 1880, 1900, 1910, 1920, 1930. Okay. And it goes up to 1930, and that's where it stops. The numbers would just keep going up, though. I'd like to see a modern version of this table. And if somebody could share with me a modern version of this table, I would be very appreciative. Okay. But yeah, she's focused on this progressive era time frame. All right. Remember, this is between 1870 and 1930 is almost the entire story of the American working class. I mean, obviously it goes back before that, but when the Farmers Alliance joined with the miners, and you had millions of black farmers allying with millions of white miners, and creating a party of their own and resisting, and the struggle that got violent. That was all between 1870 and 1880. Okay. This is all in the aftermath of the Civil War, right? This is when a lot of freed slaves found themselves basically indentured slaves working as, sharecroppers, right? This is the period that W.E.B. Du Bois is out like exploring the world and interviewing thousands of black farmers and workers in the Souls of Black Folk, his seminal work, The Souls of Black Folk. But this is also the period of mass working class antagonism and organizing that results in what becomes the Populist Party that was anti-Democrats and anti-Republicans, which is why Democrats and Republicans in various ways established laws to return institutionalized racism to something that in some ways was worse than pre-Civil War era, right? This is the time that it's a response to this that laws forcing segregation and Jim Crow, that's what all of that is. That's where this comes from, right? So in the Renewing Black Intellectual History, the anthology of very important essays put together by Dr. Adolph Reed, and I think his name is like Kenneth Williams or something like that. One of the things that is so important is like their analysis of how historians who do like racial history tend to like, oh yeah, white people felt bad about slavery and so to some degree capitulated, and then they became more racist afterwards. This is kind of the narrative. And they show how all of these mainstream historians kind of prop up that narrative. Okay, but it's not so simple, right? They leave out the fact that millions of black and white farmers and miners were working together against Democrats and Republicans. They leave out the fact that the codification of these racial segregation laws and the propaganda that tried to turn black and white workers against each other was a response to the successes of working class organizing. Okay. And that's obviously why Republicans and Democrats had a common interest, was because these workers didn't see a future in either of those two parties. So, it's a very important part of the puzzle here. But okay, so back to the table one. The engineers in 1870 was like roughly 5,000, almost 7,000, or almost 6,000 engineers. Okay. Goes up to 7,000 a decade later, goes up to 38,000 a decade later. In 1910, it's 77,000. In 1920, it's 134,000. In 1930, there's now 217 engineers. Okay, so 1870, 5.6 thousand. 1930, which is only like what? How many years later is that? Can I math? 60 years later, it's gone up to 217,000. Okay, we see similar trends with all of the other professions mentioned. Managers go from 57,000 up to 313,000 in this period. Social recreation and religious workers that are not clergy, they don't even get mentioned until 1910, at which point there's 19,000, and then that goes up to 71,000. Okay. College faculty goes from 5.6, just like the engineers, to 82,000 in 1930. Accountants and auditors, they didn't even make a dent at the time that Marx was writing. Okay. And then that goes up to 23,000 in the 1900s, and then 39,000 10 years later, 118,000 10 years later. Finally, in 1930, accountants and auditors now make up 192,000. That is a workforce, okay? Government officials, administrators, and inspectors, they don't make a dent before the 1900s. And then in the 1900s, it's 58,000 to 72,000 to 100,000, finally to 124,000, okay? Editors and reporters, once again, no dent. Like they're such a small fraction of the population that you can't really account for them. And then in the 1900s, you got 32,000. We don't really have a number for where they were at in the 1910s. And then in 1920s, up to 41,000. 1930s, up to 61,000. Okay. In terms of total population, if we add all of these different professions together, and these are professions that by definition require going to college in almost all cases, okay? Or some pretty intensive privileged, educational regime other than college. Total population in 1870 starts out at basically 40 million. And then by 1930 is up to 123 million. Okay, back to reading. We've already sketched the conditions which prepared the way for the expansion of these occupations, a growing and increasingly centralized social surplus, and intensified struggle between the bourgeoisie and the proletariat. But it would be wrong to think of the emerging PMC as being no more than passive recruits for the occupational roles required by monopoly capital. The people entering the class in formation were drawn from an older middle class. They were the sons and daughters of businessmen, independent professionals, prosperous farmers, etc. Groups which feared their own extinction in the titanic struggle between capital and labor. The generation entering managerial and professional roles between 1890 and 1920 consciously grasped the roles which they had to play. They understood their own self-interest was bound up in reforming capitalism, and they articulated their understanding far more persistently and clearly than did the capitalist class itself. The role of the emerging PMC, as they saw it, was to mediate the basic class conflict of capitalist society and create a rational, reproducible social order. As Edward A. Ross, a prominent professor and progressive ideologue, wrote in 1907, after surveying the conflict and corruption of turn-of-the-century capitalism, quote, "Social defense is coming to be a matter for the expert. The rearing of dikes against faithlessness and fraud calls for intelligent social engineering. If, in this strait, the public does not speedily become far shrewder, there is nothing for it but to turn over the defense of a society to professionals." Social defense is coming to be a matter for the expert. Social defense. Yeah? Against what? In the following sentence, faithlessness and frauds. Okay, fair enough. Wouldn't it be nice to have some kind of defenses against faithlessness and fraud? Too bad the university isn't well equipped to do that for us. But what do we really need a social defense against? This is 1907. It's a response to working class antagonism. There's nothing, unless the public becomes so much shrewder, unless everybody becomes smarter about the current situation, he's saying, there's nothing that anyone's going to be able to do except to turn over the defense of society to professionals. These professionals who were writing these kinds of things, these progressives who are part of this era, were selling capitalists on the idea of the PM. they weren't just having a conversation with themselves. They were speaking to the capitalist class saying, look, you need us. You can't just send in the Pinkertons to beat people up. You need us to come in and make things work. Many people of all classes subscribed to parts of this outlook and stood to benefit one way or another from the progressive reforms which were associated with. For our purposes, the striking things about progressive ideology and reforms are: 1. Their direct and material contribution to the creation and expansion of professional and managerial occupational slots. 2. Their intimate relation to the emergence and articulation of the PMC's characteristic ideologies. And 3. Their association with the creation of characteristic PMC class institutions, such as professional organizations. The growth of the PMC, 1. The growth of the PMC. Every effort to mediate class conflict and rationalize capitalism served to create new institutionalized roles for reformers, as in to expand the PMC. This is, by the way, today, and I'm adding this, this is the solution to every kind of marginalization or bigotry by liberals today. Oh, we just need a few more people with jobs in HR to raise consciousness and do workshops and take reports, or, further kind of breathe down the necks of the people in the workplace, and, find ways of getting involved that will make it so that the companies are not liable for being sued for accusations of whatever kinds of bigotry or marginalization it is that they're combating. So the solution to bigotry and marginalization is always someone whose role it will be to center that marginalized person. It's always going to require the representative to step in, and Robin DiAngelo or Kimber Max Kendi to come in, and their intervention is seen as the solution to these things, right? Because education is the solution to everything, right? Banger comment from Nance. He said, "We developed this treatment. You have to take it every day for the rest of your life. No, it can't be cured." 100%. So yeah, bringing it back around, every effort to mediate class conflict and rationalize capitalism served to create new institutionalized roles for reformers, as in to expand the PMC. Settlement houses, domestic science training courses, adult education classes in literacy, English, patriotism, etc., provided jobs for social workers who formed the National Conference of Social Workers in 1911, and home economists who formed the American Home Economics Association in 1909, etc. Child labor laws, compulsory school attendance laws, factory health and safety inspections, etc., created jobs for truant officers, teachers, and inspectors of various kinds. Obviously, having a lot of truant officers only expands juvenile disciplinary apparatuses, which obviously is a sort of gateway into the prison industrial complex. Similarly, municipal reform meant the establishment of committees of city planners, architects, engineers, statisticians, sociologists to plan and administer the health, recreation, welfare, housing, and other functions of the metropolis. At the federal level, conservationist demands pushed by the emerging engineering profession, among others, led to the creation of federal agencies employing engineers to watch over and plan resource use. The Pure Food and Drug Act, the establishment of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, the Federal Trade Commission, etc., all in addition to their direct impact in regulating business, gathering information, etc., offered thousands of jobs. Public policy in general became dependent on input from specialists, experts, professors. It is a great thing, exalted political economy professor Richard T. Ely, another major progressive era ideologue, on reading the report of the U.S. Industrial Commission established by Congress in 1998, that there are in this country a body of economic experts, and that the state of public opinion is such as to demand their employment. The rationalizing drive of the emerging PMC struck deep into the business enterprise itself. The early years of the century saw the transformation of the internal functioning of the corporation at the hands of a rapidly growing core of managers. Scientific managers, lawyers, financial experts, engineers, personnel experts, etc. Scientific managers put in scare quotes there because, If that gives you the idea that the managers are all a bunch of scientists, that's not the point. The point is to make the management over labor as scientific as possible, okay? Which means systematized. It has nothing to do with like objective truth, okay? As early as 1886, Henry R. Townes had admonished the American Society of Mechanical Engineers, the source of much early management thought, that the matter of shop management is of equal importance with that of engineering. By the early 1900s, Townes, Taylor, Gant, the Gilbraiths, and other engineers were churning out papers on how to rationalize all aspects of the business enterprise. College-level schools and departments of business administration rapidly appeared to teach the new creed. The American Association of Collegiate Schools of Business was founded in 1916. The managers held conferences, formed associations, for example, the Society to Promote the Science of Management in 1912, and the American Management Association out of several already existing societies. In 1923, and published, that was all a parenthetical. This is confusing. I'm confused. So the example is the Society to Promote the Science of Management in 1912 and the American Management Association out of several already existing societies in 1923. Now I'm going to go back and read the sentence without the parenthetical, just so we can get back on track. Oh, this is all inside of a bigger parenthetical. Fuck me. Wait, no, it's not. Okay. The managers held conferences, formed associations, and published professional journals. End of sentence. Though she does in another parenthetical give some examples. Engineering Magazine in 1891, Factory in 1908, the Bulletin of the Taylor Society in 1916. I would fucking kill to get my hands on those. Please, are those in the time machine? Can we get those off of the Internet Archive? Engineering Magazine, 1891, Factory, 1908, the Bulletin of the Taylor Society, 1960. Please, could we get some? I mean, they're legible. We would be able to read them. Like, it's not like this is like Shakespearean Old English or some other language. Like, I would love, this is back when professionals were being explicit about what they were doing and when they were doing it in a class conscious way. I would love to get my hands on these. Holy snopes. The introduction of modern methods of management was a reform which was understood by contemporary observers to be part of the overall progressive cause. In fact, scientific management first became known to the public as a tool for the progressive attack on corporate greed. In the Eastern Rates case of 1911, the Interstate Commerce Commission turned down an increase in railroad rates after scientific management expert H. Emerson testified that proper management would cut $1 million a day off the cost of rail shipments. Scientific management, as taught in the new business schools, exalted reformer and writer Walter Lippmann would produce scientific management as taught in the new business schools. Exalted reformer and writer Walter Lippmann would produce a new professional breed of managers who would help lift American business out of the cesspool of commercialism. To the managers themselves, quote, scientific management became something of a movement. In an age of growing achievement in the physical sciences, it offered the hope of resolving industrial problems also through the use of objective principles. For young and imaginative engineers, it provided an ethos and a mission in life. The movement soon became replete with popularizers, traditionalists, and dissidents. After the initial periods of resistance, it conquered the citadels of old-fashioned industrial management in the United States and had a tremendous effect on industrial practice. It had a major influence on the growing reform and economy in public administration. End quote. The development of a class... Okay. So that was all one for her, okay? This is two. Two, the development of a class outlook. From the beginning, the nascent, which means new, young, the newly emerging PMC, possessed a class outlook which was distinct from and often antagonistic to that of the capitalist class. It is true that, with hindsight, one is struck by the ultimate concordance of interests between the two classes. Even at that time, New Republic editor Herbert Croly noted that progressivism was, quote, designed to serve as a counterpoise to the threat of working class revolution, end quote. And a wealthy philanthropist friend of Jane Addams noted appreciatively that Addams was, quote, really an interpreter between working men and the people who lived in luxury on the other side of the city. And she gave the people of her neighborhood quite a different idea about the men and women who were ordinarily called capitalists, end quote. Class harmony was the stated goal of many outstanding spokespeople, and to many in the capitalist class as well. It was clear that professionals could be more effective in the long run than Pinkertons. But the PMC was not merely a class of lackeys. The capitalists fought vigorously to block or modify those PMC-supported reforms which they saw as threatening their interests. As for the PMC, the very ideals of objectivity, rationality, etc., which justified their role to the capitalists, inevitably led them into conflict with the capitalists. Okay, so this is where we'll start to get to some of the antagonisms between the PMC and the capitalists, because there are some. For one thing, the roles the PMC was entering and carving out for itself as technical innovators, social mediators, culture producers, etc., required a high degree of autonomy, if only for the sake of legitimation. Claims, which means no one's going to take a journalist seriously if that journalist doesn't have some autonomy, right? So some autonomy is necessary. And obviously, if capitalists could just snap their fingers and have everybody comply, they'd be a lot happier. It'd be a lot easier if journalists had to toe the line. But some degree of wiggle room, some degree of autonomy legitimizes things. Kind of like how I talked about in the Idea of the University course, my last sort of presentation, where I went into the direction of science in capitalism versus communism, right? In communism, it was like, oh, does this or does this not align with dialectical historical materialism? Oh, it doesn't sufficiently, then it's out. It's gone. You're fired. Or it's obviously like directly repressive in that case, and the autonomy, nobody thinks that there's autonomy in this situation, right? But science and capitalism seems like you get to choose what you want to research, right? Yeah. You get to choose what to get excited about, and you only get to get excited about the things that are on offer, or in terms of like what there's funding for, right? So you have to get yourself excited about something and then be like, yeah, I chose this. Claims to objectivity cannot be made from an objective position of servality, like, the servality being the affect of a servant, right? Deference is a word that she's already used. The conflict over occupational autonomy was particularly visible in the universities. The enormous expansion of higher education in the latter part of the century and the early part of the 20th century had been underwritten by men like Johns Hopkins, Leland Stanford, and above all, John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Battles over academic freedom often brought faculty into direct confrontation with capitalist trustees, with the professors asserting their autonomy But the conflict between the PMC and the capitalist class went deeper than the issue of occupational autonomy. Early PMC leaders envisioned a technocratic transformation of society in which all aspects of life would be rationalized according to expert knowledge. For example, Frederick Winslow Taylor, the leader of the movement for scientific... Did I say James Taylor earlier? I meant Frederick Winslow Taylor. How could I mess up? Frederick Winslow Taylor, the leader of the movement management, saw scientific management as much more than a set of techniques to streamline production. Quote, the same principles can be applied with equal force to all social activities, to the management of our tradesmen, large and small, of our churches, our philanthropic institutions, our universities, and our governmental department. What other reforms would do as much toward promoting prosperity, toward the diminution of poverty, and the alleviation of suffering? End quote. So basically, Taylor sees the solution to every form of unrest as the application of his scientific management principles to every other aspect of life, to churches, philanthropic institutions, universities, etc., etc., etc. Okay, so I want to thank Nance for sharing a thing. What's it called here? It's the November 1916 bulletin of the Taylor Society. I took a break and gave it a quick skim, and was able to deduce that they were, self-consciously talking about the origin of their society and of the PMC as a response to labor organizing. And obviously all done in a way where it's like, this is genius. This is the good thing that will better society. It's progressive. It's not this brutal, form of domination, and that only enlivens and further polarizes class antagonism. No, it's something that creates harmony. So that's all there. It's a cool historic document. I probably only got like a quarter of the way into it, and plan on trying to listen to the rest of it later. But point being, I said it would be cool to get our hands on some of this, some of these earlier works from around that time period. And Nance, you're awesome. Thank you. That was really cool. Okay, so bringing it back around, we've just gotten through Taylor's quote there, and then we're going to have another example from the Ehrenreichs. It goes, they say, or as E.D. Meyer, the president of the American Society of Mining Engineers, put it in 1911, quote, the golden rule will be put into practice through the slide rule of the engineer, end quote. What's the slide rule of the engineer? Does anybody know what that is? Let me know in the comments. Of course, efficiency, order, and rationality are not in the goals. Even scientific management met with initial resistance from many in the business community who saw it as a potential threat to their own autonomy from outside surveillance. Scientific management, as already mentioned, was originally popularized as a tool for the public to use to judge the fairness of corporate prices. Engineers, perhaps because of their workaday intimacy with capitalist concerns, often saw the recalcitrance of capital most clearly. To give a trivial but telling example, in 1902 and again in efforts of reform-minded engineers to get the American Society of Mechanical Engineers to support the campaign for conversion to the metric system were defeated by capitalist opposition. Most capital equipment was already calibrated in English units. Quote, the businessman is the master, the engineer his good slave, end quote, complained a writer in Engineering News in 1904. Out of these continual skirmishes over academic freedom, progressive reforms, consumer issues, etc., many in the PMC were led to more systematic anti-capitalist outlooks. One widely publicized variety of PMC anti-capitalism was that represented by Thorstein Veblen's technocratic critique. Veblen portrayed the contemporary capitalists as a parasitic class no less decadent than the European aristocracy. The captains of industry, he argued, quote, have always turned the technologists and their knowledge to account, only so far as would serve their own commercial profit, not to the extent of their ability, or to the limit set by the material circumstances, or by the needs of the community. To do their work as it should be done, these men of the industrial general staff, for example, or as in engineers and managers, must have a free hand, unhampered by commercial considerations and reservation. It is an open secret that with a reasonably free hand, the production experts would today readily increase the ordinary output of industry by sevenfold, variously estimated at some 300% to 1200% of the current output. And what stands in the way of so increasing the ordinary output of goods and services is business as usual, end quote. Progress demanded that the capitalists be swept away to make room, not for the working class, but for the rising class of experts. But Veblen's vision of a technocracy, a government by the experts, smacked too overtly of PMC self-interest to gain a wide following, even within the class. In fact, Edward Ross, who in 1907 had himself called for extensive social engineering, was moved to write, somewhat defensively in 1920, there is, of course, no such thing as government by experts. The malicious phrase is but a sneer flung by scheming self-seekers who find in the relentless veracity of modestly paid trained investigators a barrier across their path. The strongest expression of PMC anti-capitalist ideology was to be found in explicitly socialist politics, which in the early 20th century United States meant the which in the early 20th century United States meant the Socialist Party. Quote, in the United States, probably more than anywhere else, socialism is recruiting heavily from the better classes of society, boasted party leader Morris Hillquit in 1907. Although the party had a large working class membership, people we would identify as members of the PMC and people we would identify as members of the PMC were clearly a minority in the party as a whole, most of the top leadership and a vastly disproportionate part of the membership were engaged in class occupation or had been so engaged before assuming full-time party duties. In fact, socialism, as articulated by the pre-World War I Socialist Party, was frequently not far from the PMC's technocratic vision. Socialism meant government ownership of the means of production, which would still be administered by experts, and expansion of government social services, which would still be supplied by professionals, or intellectual proletarians, as Hillquit called them. Socialism in this version formed a continuum with non-socialist progressivism. Party leader William Ghent even complained that Teddy Roosevelt's 1912 Progressive Party platform, a platform designed to attract the middle-class reform vote without foundationally upsetting capitalist priorities, quote, begins its program with the brazen theft of half the working program of the Socialist Party. On the right wing of the party, even such traditional socialist notions as class struggle were considered too radical and were replaced by progressive ideals of class conciliation. Class hatred, wrote writer, social worker, and party national executive member John Spargo, was a monstrous thing to be abhorred by all right-thinking men and women. 3. The consolidation of the professional managerial class. In the period up to mid-century, professional managerial occupation expanded much more rapidly than the workforce as a whole. The people filling these occupations and their families came more and more to constitute a socially coherent class. Collectively, the PMC consolidated its cultural hegemony over the working class as the army of counselors, psychologists, teachers, etc. swelled from the 20s on. But the early PMC's radical dream of a technocratic society was not, of course, to be realized. To the extent that the PMC established itself as a major class in 20th century American society, it did so on terms set by the capitalist class. Individually, many PMC members scaled the highest pinnacles of power, either to bask there temporarily as consultants and advisors, Edward Bernays is a good example of that, or to remain as permanent members of the ruling class. Acceptance came gradually. Self-made capitalists like Andrew Carnegie initially had little use for experts and college men in their enterprises. But by the teens, experts, college professors, researchers, PMC civic reformers, had become indispensable and routine members of the boards of trustees of key capitalist-sponsored institutions, replacing the token clergymen of an earlier era. In 1918, when President Wilson went off to the peace conference in Paris, he publicly acknowledged the importance of the PMC by taking along with him a grand conclave of expert advisors from several fields of knowledge, which was known to contemporaries as the Inquiry. Within industry, as the size and complexity of corporations, PMC occupations such as engineering, law, and financial management became recruiting grounds for top management, as into the ruling class itself. For the great majority of the members of the PMC, however, the only guarantee of security, never mind autonomous power, lay in collective action. The characteristic form of self-organization of the PMC was the profession. The defining characteristics of professions should be seen as representing simultaneously both the aspirations of the PMC and the claims which are necessary to justify those aspirations to the other classes of capitalist society. These characteristics are, in brief, A, the existence of a specialized body of knowledge accessible only by lengthy training. B, the existence of ethical standards which include a commitment to public service. And C, a measure of autonomy from outside interference in the practice of the profession. For example, only members of the profession can judge the value of a fellow professional's work. The claims to specialized knowledge and ethical standards serve to justify the bid for autonomy, which is most commonly directed at the capitalist class. Furthermore, the profession, or claim to profession, of specialized knowledge ensures that the PMC can control its own reproduction as a class. Lengthy training has barred working class entrance to the professions and given a decided advantage to the children of the PMC itself. The claim to high ethical standards represents the PMC's persistent reassurance that its class interests are identical to the interests of society at large. Finally, all three characteristics of professions are aimed at ensuring that the relationship between the individual professional and his or her client, student, patient, etc., is one of benign domination. Between the 1880s and 1920, medicine, law, social work, engineering, and teaching emerged in their modern form, complete with professional organizations and journals and legally enforced criteria for admissions, as in accrediting and training institutions and or licensing of individual practitioners. At the same time, the learned professions were sorting themselves out and taking organizational form. Natural philosophy subdivided into the modern natural sciences. Psychology detached itself from philosophy. Sociology, history, and political science began to go their separate ways, etc. The device of professionalism was not universally or uniformly successful. Some occupations, like nursing, are professions more out of courtesy than social reality. Other more clearly PMC occupations, such as engineering, can hardly claim to have a professional degree of autonomy. Between 1900 and 1920, many of the U.S. societies were torn by struggles between professional-minded engineers who saw themselves as professionals first and employees second, and business-oriented engineers whose first loyalty was to their employing. The business-oriented faction triumphed, for the most part, even going so far as to permit untrained businessmen to join the engineers' professional societies. From the perspective of the entire class, professionalism had an inherent disadvantage strategy for class advancement. Specialization was the PMC member's chief selling point, the quality which justified his or her claim to a unique niche in society, but it acted as a centrifugal force on the class as a whole. Consider that in 1900, a scholar such as William James could flit from teaching physiology to psychology and finally to philosophy without unduly discomfiting the Harvard administration. And in 1919, Veblen, in Engineers in the Price System, could still lump together engineers and all sorts of managers and administrators under the common roof engineer. But by mid-century, the class was so minutely splintered that even terms such as scientist or engineer no longer signified groups with common workplace concerns or even a common language. The deeper rift, overriding the petty occupational subspecializations, was the one which developed between the managers, administrators, and engineers on the one hand, and those in the liberal arts and service professions on the other. The material difference between the two groups was that those in the first category are directly tied to business and industry. Their jobs are, not infrequently, way stations on the road into the ruling class itself. Those in the second category are more likely to enjoy the relative shelter of the or other sorts of non-profit agencies and to be firmly fixed within the PMC. Although with this difference in apparent sources of subsidy went a difference in general political outlook. The managerial technical community came to pride itself on its hard-headedness and even on its indifference to the social consequences of its labor, as in its helplessness. The second group, those in the more liberal pursuits, became the only repository of the traditional PMC and to capital. Managers and engineers on the one side, liberal academics on the other, came to view each other across a gulf of distrust and contempt. But we should not overestimate the significance of this division. The PMC at mid-century still constituted a single coherent class. The actual employment, experience, and social attitudes of managers and engineers and those in the liberal professions are hardly more divergent than those of such working class groups as, say, clerical workers and steel workers. The image of non-managerial professions as ivory tower bound, somewhat impractical intellectuals has always or has little counterpart in reality, right? The idea of like the detached ivory tower site, it's not really. 70% of the country's scientists and engineers are employed in business. Half the rest are in government. Even leaving out the engineers, only 1/5 of the physicists and 2/5 of the life scientists are employed by universities. Well under half of the professional and scientific workers in all fields, including the social sciences, are employed by educational and other nonprofit institutions. In the business and governmental organizations which employ most professionals, the professional typically is employed in a managerial or semi-managerial role. As for the minority of professionals who are in academic and similar institutions, they are hardly aloof from what C. Wright Mills called the managerial demiurge. They greedily accept consulting positions with industry and government, and within their institutions, they take on a variety of managerial and administrative functions, administering grants, supervising research, and teaching assistants, running departments and institutes. The image of the corporate middle manager as completely divorced from the academic world is equally overdrawn. Over 80% of corporate managers at all levels in large corporations have college training or graduate training, about half in the liberal arts, the rest divided equally between engineering and business. Professional graduate training in law, engineering, or business schools, which correctly tell their students that they are being trained in applied social science, more and more becomes a prerequisite for advance on the management ladder. Moreover, the various groups within the PMC are socially coherent. Paul Sweezy has argued that the basic test of whether two families belong to the same class or not is the freedom with which they intermarry. The children of the PMC members do overwhelmingly tend to marry within the class. Marriage down to the working class or up to the ruling class is comparatively infrequent. In line with the frequency of intermarriage, the class exhibits a substantial degree of intergenerational stability. Children of PMC families are more than twice as likely as children of working class families to themselves enter PMC occupation. Moreover, the class is characterized by a common culture or lifestyle. The interior life of the class is shaped by the problem of class reproduction. Unlike ruling class occupations, PMC occupations are never directly hereditary. The son of the chairman of the board may expect to become a successful businessman, or at least a wealthy one, more or less growing up. The son of the research scientist knows he can only hope to achieve a similar position through continuous effort. Traditionally, much of this effort has come from the women of the class, since according to psychologists, a child's future achievement is determined by the nuances of its early upbringing. Women of the class have been expected to stay home and specialize in child raising. Both sexes, however, are expected to perform well in school and attend good colleges, for it is at college that young men acquire the credentials for full class membership, and young women acquire, in addition to their own degrees, credentialed husbands. As a result of the anxiety about class reproduction, all of the ordinary experiences of life, growing up, giving birth, child raising, are freighted with an external significance unknown in other classes. Private life thus becomes too arduous to be lived in private. The inner life of the PMC must be continuously shaped, updated, and revised. Of course, ever-mounting numbers of experts in child raising, family living, sexual fulfillment, self-realization, etc., etc. The very insecurity of the class, then, provides new ground for class expansion. By mid-century, the PMC was successful enough to provide a new mass market for many of its own services, and unsuccessful enough to need them. There's an important footnote here. She kind of mentions this in Fear of Falling as well. Betty Friedan's book, The Feminine Mystique, published in 1963, points out the inherent contradictions in this mode of class reproduction. Women of the class are educated along with men, then required to do the unpaid menial labor. Friedan herself feared that the degradation of PMC women was leading to the deterioration of the children and hence the entire class. Her book is a strongly class-conscious statement, concerned more with the future of her class than with the fate of women of all classes. Nonetheless, she accurately pinpointed one major factor in the rise of the late 20th century women's movement: the overeducation or underemployment of PMC women. Yeah, and in the modern sociological bestseller work called Paying for the Party, a lot of women in college are reporting that they are there to find a man who will support them. So Friedan is kind of touching on the point that there's a double bind here. People are being educated to enter the professions, but then becoming housewives. So then they're like overqualified to be involved in the social apparatuses, but here they are stuck at the house, right? And so there's a sense of a frustration that comes with that, but more importantly, also like the fear of the degradation of the class as a whole. I'll read the other footnote. Many of the characteristics of the PMC as a class, as a social class, are shared, of course, by portions of the classical petty bourgeoisie, such as doctors in private practice. The PMC is integrated socially with their upper strata of the petty bourgeoisie. Upper strata, we emphasize, not with the overwhelmingly larger lower strata of the petty bourgeoisie, the millions of proprietors of tiny shops, self-employed craftspeople, etc. But as we have argued earlier, this is not sufficient grounds for calling the PMC itself petty bourgeois. And finally, dear readers, aka listeners, in the second part, okay, this is the final paragraph. Yeah, here we come. Here we go. This is it. In the second part of this essay, to be published in Radical America, May through June 1977, we will discuss the growth of the PMC and its institution, for example, the university, in the 60s. We will use the theoretical framework we have developed here to analyze the emergence and history of a new left based in the PMC, including students, the PMC, and training. Finally, we will discuss the subjective relationships existing today between the PMC and the working class, and we will try to draw from this some strategic implication for the left. All right, everybody, that's it for the first part in this series of essays by the Ehrenreichs. And so I appreciate you all for joining, for following along to whatever degree you were able to. If you were getting distracted throughout all of that, then wonderful thing, you can always play it again. And just in the same way that having MSNBC or some other television network playing in the background, eventually you tune in and tune out and tune in and tune out, but you inculcate something from all of that, right? So even if you didn't get a lot on the first pass, don't worry, you can do more passes later. And you can always come back to specific sections that stick in your head that you want to sit there and really read on your own, So I love listening as the first pass and then coming back over the important parts later. Nance said that he thinks the element of domestic control is huge, the expropriation of family values and shit. He said the death of family and the paternalism. These are all really big factors that she talks about. And he said he got a lot of notes. So I'm glad that somebody in the audience got a lot of notes there. He's also just done the week one reflection for the PMC course. And so as this course lives on and people are able to enroll in it over time, there's going to be this backlog of lectures people are able to listen to, as well as the discussion on the forum, where we have contributions from folks like Nance who are doing stellar reflections and bringing in all kinds of cool sources and personal anecdotes and stuff like that. And so what we are all doing here is developing ourselves in our understanding of class analysis in the 21st century. So hats off to you for doing that, because this is important work. It's work that a lot of people want to avoid or run away from. It's not highly marketable, okay? This is not something that people are lining up to do, but it's important if you're serious. And a lot of people reveal how unserious they are by their inability to take this seriously, by their fragility when it comes to questions of class composition, right? So I guess the thing I want to leave off with is that if you take this course and you do the weekly reflections and you develop a final project, there are forms of that final project that will be considered for publication later, and there will be a conference where you are able to present either by reading or just talking about what you have there. And we will have panels of people who have done the similar readings on the reflections on the forum, and the live audience will be able to enjoy seeing a conversation between people who actually share a basis in the literature, which is something that's surprisingly rare and exciting to see nowadays. So come tour time, when we're traveling the United States, there will be events at cities across the United States, and people who have been involved with this course, as well as other ones being offered by Theory Underground, will have opportunities to present. And they will also have opportunities to get published. And so if you sign up for and take the PMC course sooner rather than later, you might be able to get into the first publication, which will be an anthology of reviews and critical essays that are drawing from and applying the readings that we are working through during this first phase of Theory Underground. So if you are interested in that, if you want to participate in these events in the future, this would be a prerequisite of that. Make sure to sign up for the PMC course. It's cheaper than it's ever going to be. And finally, speaking of money, if you want to support, go to theory-underground.com/support. And you can either donate or purchase something there. And thank you. Thank you for coming along for this ride. And I look forward to seeing you at the next one. Peace.
In an attempt to bring in new people to the world of philosophy and theory while building on relationships already established, we are doing a countrywide tour of the United States this fall. Are we coming to a city or town near you? Do you think there is a venue or audience in your local region that would be interested in a lecture or facilitated discussion about existentialism, critiques of therapism, PMC ideology, self-help, introduction to philosophy, or the time-energy critique of any of those things? This speaking and discussion facilitation tour will include the Pacific Northwest in mid-August, the Kansas City, Missouri area, late August or early September, Philadelphia at the beginning of October, and really we're going to be all over the area there, hopefully, so get in contact with us if you think that we should come visit your state. Phoenix, Arizona, mid-October, and SoCal, especially San Diego, late October. I say especially San Diego because we already have our guide for the San Diego region. What's the difference between a host, a guide, and a volunteer, you ask? Well, thanks for asking, actually. The volunteer role is for people who want to put up posters or in other ways promote the events that will be occurring in their town or city, whereas the host might have a guest bedroom, guest house, or a place that we can park our van so that we can sleep in our van. We need to know if you would have like bathroom facilities or anything like that. And so the form on the website is where you can tell us what you have to offer. Guiding, on the other hand, though, people who love to guide take a lot of pride in their local knowledge. A good example of that would be Michael Downs when I visited him in Raytown, Missouri, and he took me into Kansas City and we had barbecue, and he took me to the mall and to all these other landmark places from his life growing up there. But a more recent example would be my friend Michael in Poland, who took us around Katowice, Poland, and basically gives a historical and sociological analysis of everything, and it was amazing. It was one of the coolest things we've ever experienced, and it made us realize some people just want to provide the space and privacy, whereas other people want to take you out and show you around. And so if you're interested in being a volunteer, host, or guide, we have a special form for that. So please fill out your information and get in contact with us as soon as possible so we can fit you into the schedule, because we'll love to meet you, touch base with the local community. And if you don't think anyone else in your area is interested in the things that you're interested in, if you don't think anyone else is into this stuff, well, we might be able to surprise you.
When I saw that poster, Boulder Art in Boise, fucking Idaho, are you kidding me? It was virtually an answer to an unspoken prayer, It really was. And I just couldn't believe that somebody was interested in the things that I was interested in, that I had been interested in for years and had kind of given up on in futility. I'd labored in solitude for so long. I had no one to talk to about it, no one to bounce ideas off.
This tour is going to bring together a lot of people who want to be based in text with the people they're in conversation with. And yeah, I think it's going to be a fantastic year. The only other thing that I want to say is that Michael Downs' first book is going to be published by Theory Underground really soon here. I've got another book coming out really soon here. These books will be spread throughout the United States on this tour. So I'm hoping to be able to do some actual book launch events at various bookstores. Outside of that, I guess the last thing that I would say is that Michael Downs is gearing up to teach For They Know Not What They Do by Slavoj Žižek. We're putting out all these introduction videos and other interviews related to the topic of Hegel, Lacan, Žižek, because we want to give people an accessible and sturdy basis in the discourse. The problem is that Michael Downs is very busy having to work at a wage slave job. And so if you want to help in freeing Mikey, make sure to go to his Patreon at patreon.com/thedangerousbaby and make a donation. Thank you. I would be remiss to close this out without a quick shout out to our patrons and our anonymous donors. Thank you so much for the donations already. We've only been around for a month. We already got over $3,000 in donations. And so thank you. And stay tuned for the app, which is on its way. There will be a Theory Underground app. So the current setup is that it is a social media site built around courses where you can suppose that people who are involved in the discussions have a shared interest in the same or similar texts, and where you can assume in a lot of the discussions that, yeah, people have read the stuff that you're reading, that you're bringing into dialogue. And so, for instance, The Idea of the University by Carl Jaspers, dedicated for him. Slavoj Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, dedicated for him. And then as people take the course over the years, new people will be coming into that forum. And so if you get in there early, you'll be able to see how the conversation evolves. And as new people add into the conversation, it'll bring back memories and like things that you want to work through, questions that you had with the first time that you read the text. And so I'm really excited for this. The reason I've built this website is because I think that this is what's lacking in so many other spaces, is that ability to return, to be able to communicate after the fact and in a sustained way on a platform that's not attention grabby and annoying like Discord. And so stay tuned, because there is an app on the way. Thank you to our donors. If you want to donate, go to theory-underground.com/support. Thank you.